thank you for joining our webinar today. You're here to learn about supporting transfer student success, 5 key faculty practices. So thanks very much for joining us. Just to set some ground rules, I want to let you know that the session is being recorded today, so that if you have to skip out for any moment of time or you want to share the recording with your colleagues later, you'll see that it is being recorded right up there. Probably see that at the top of your screen. But just a few quick notes. Today is planned for a 50-minute webinar with at least 10 minutes for question and answers at the end. You heard Peter say earlier that the chat box is open, so we'd love for you to put your chats, your thoughts, or questions as you have them in the chat. The QA box is also open, so if you have a specific question that you definitely want our panelists to see today, do ask that you put that in the QA box. We're going to be monitoring that throughout and answer them as we can, and then certainly come back to that at the end to address all of your questions. Please watch your inbox. We'll send you an email when the recording is ready, as well as a handout of today's slides and a copy of the guide that we're going to be talking about here shortly. And then if you would please take some time to submit an evaluation. It's a really quick process, but we'd love to know what you thought about the session and make sure we're meeting all of our objectives. So with that, I wanted to quickly welcome you from my friends at NISTS. We saw so many wonderful names on the registration list, some people we knew and some were new to us. So if you are brand new to NISTS, welcome. We're so glad you're here. Just quickly to let you know, NISTS is a national nonprofit professional development organization dedicated to empowering professionals, faculty, and administrators to be transfer champions, agents, connectors, advocates who challenge the status quo to improve the transfer student experience. So we do that through a variety of professional development opportunities, including webinars like this one. We also have a large 100% transfer focused annual conference that happens every February. And then we also do a lot of reports and how-to guides like the one we're going to be talking about today that we really try to provide practical tips and strategies for working with transfer students. So thanks so much for being here with us. We're happy to have you. As we get going into our conversation, I want to give you just a little bit of background about how this guide came to be. And you can see what it's going to look like when it's all polished up and ready for release here in another day or two. But as so many of these wonderful collaborations happen, it's a little bit of happenstance, a little bit of luck, and a little bit of the universe telling us that we need a guide like this. So I was familiar with some of Julie's recent research about how important faculty interactions are with transfer students as early as possible in their transfer process, but then also had a great opportunity to know and meet Peter at a conference and learn about his work and a book he was writing called Relationship Rich Education. And as I talked to them both and sort of understood what they were researching and learning, it became so clear to me that they were talking about very much the same thing, and that these two folks should meet and get in a room. And so that's what happened. We started meeting, added more authors to our writing team, and that's, how it happened. The rest is history. Magic occurred when we all got in the room and started talking about how our faculty members can make more transfer inclusive climates in their classroom. So I would love to introduce you and let you meet the authors you're going to be hearing from, today's panelists. So I'll turn it over.
Hello, everyone. I'm just so excited to be in community with you all today. I'm Xueli Wang. I'm a professor specializing in higher education leadership with a particular focus on community colleges and transfer pathways. And so every time I'm in community with you all, I just got really inspired because you're on the ground doing the work and leading the way. And really, really looking forward to the rest of our collaboration today and beyond.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Felton. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, where Julie is based, but I work at Elon University now in North Carolina. I'm a professor of history, and I run something called the Center for Engaged Learning, and I'm also in the provost's office, doing lots of things, supporting transfer students, working with faculty. Great to see you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Lance Goodman, the Dean of Building, Engineering, and Skilled Trades at Durham Technical Community College. I'm from Clayton, North Carolina. Spent much of my time working with transfer students as well, particularly in the STEM programs. I also faculty who teach the transfer math classes. So just excited to be here and thrilled for the opportunity to talk more about what we bring here as a team. So excited to be here, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Uzzini, Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream. We are a national nonprofit network of community colleges, technical colleges, and tribal colleges. We're based in Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon. Before coming to ATD, my background is in psychology. I've been a faculty member at 2-year and 4-year institutions, and I led the Teaching and Learning Center at Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York for several years. It's great to be with you today.
And my name is Emily Kittrell. I'm an assistant director at NISTS. And so I've had just the wonderful pleasure of getting to know these amazing researchers and practitioners. I'm a student affairs practitioner myself. Prior to joining NISTS, I worked at a small 2-year campus of a hybrid institution dealing with orientation and registration and student onboarding. So I got to see the transfer journey, both from the planning and sort of pre-transfer, but also the post-transfer. We had a lot of transfer students come into our campus as well. So excited to be here. I want to share a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So just to outline the topics, we're going to give a very tiny transfer landscape overview, look at a little bit of data. We're going to introduce the 5 key practices that we talk about in our brand new guide. And then we're going to brainstorm together some ideas for sharing and using the guide at our own campuses, and then hopefully get you to join that conversation as well, so that we can see how this might live on your campuses. We have a couple of caveats though to today's conversation. So the first one is, we know that we have lots of people on the call here. John?
Thanks, Emily. So, it's really great, and I appreciate that folks have introduced themselves and included a little bit about their roles at their institution. So I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge we are from all different kinds of institutions, serving all different profiles of students. Some of us are at institutions that are sending transfer students to a new institution. Some of us are at institutions that are receiving transfer students from another institution. Some of us are faculty, maybe full-time, maybe part-time. Some of us might be teaching, but that might not be our primary role at the institution. And some of us have a full-time role where we're not in the classroom with students, but supporting students in really meaningful and deep ways towards their success. What we hope will happen through the resource that we're releasing here and through our conversation today is that faculty will see themselves in this guide and really take to heart the 5 practices we're recommending and find ways to incorporate them into their day-to-day interactions with their students. But we also hope that if you have a role, any number of other roles besides primarily being a faculty member, that you will find ways to bring this resource to your faculty colleagues and encourage them, nudge them, support them as they are exposed to this guide and to the practices that we've written about. So we're excited to bring this to you. We're excited that there is such a diverse range of roles and institutions represented here in this audience, and we're really excited to dig in.
And I want to say just a word on behalf of our group about the pandemic context too, actually maybe 3 brief things. Recognizing the challenges and the traumas of the past 18 months. They've been really significant for our students, for our colleagues, for our institutions, and for ourselves, right? And we also want to recognize in this context that the pandemic has magnified and exacerbated existing inequities, and especially our transfer students have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And we need to recognize that, we need to see that. And as we're going into this next academic year, be really aware of that. And unfortunately, when we started this guide, we were thinking, the pandemic will be over. When it comes out, everything will be fine. Well, we're not there yet, right? The pandemic disruptions are not over. So there's a real urgency to working with all our students, especially our transfer students. But at the same time, there's a lot of exhaustion that a lot of us are feeling. This has been a long 18 months, an exhausting 18 months. The practices, the recommendations in this guide and in this work are tailored to recognize our context, both the pandemic context and more broadly, that faculty lives and all of our lives are complicated, we're busy, we're tired, we have a lot to do. At the same time, we want to recognize just how pivotal faculty are in the education of individual students and in the systems that shape students' education. So what we're going to suggest and invite you to think about today is recognizing the context and the difficulty of the context, but also recognizing the urgency of the need our students have for this kind of support. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the transfer student context and then get into the guide itself.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think you and John have both just really laid a solid foundation for today's conversation. So we're going to take that just one step slightly further and talk about some of the transfer data that we were thinking about as we approached writing this guide. We started way back last year in May and have taken our time being really thorough and making sure that we're offering suggestions that are practical and doable inside the classroom. So you may be familiar with the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, but transfer is a complex phenomenon and national transfer data is notoriously difficult to track. But the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center has integrated a few really helpful transfer reports into their regular report rotation. And they've done that over the last several years as transfer has really gained prominence in our higher ed kind of ongoing conversation. So we're going to look at a few of those today. And we basically sort of compiled and pulled bits and pieces from different reports to support today's conversation and just set the stage for what brought us to this work. So the first thing is the Transfer Mobility Report from 2018. They started with the fall 2011 cohort, and at that time, 2.8 million students were starting their higher ed journeys. Now, this was right after the Great Recession. So, the numbers here, if we were to look at today's starting class, might be a little bit higher, might be a little bit lower given the pandemic right now. But 2.8 million students were starting either at a community college or a four-year institution. And so they tracked them over 6 years to see where they went. And what they found was that 38% of those students, which is well over 1 million students, transferred at least once within 6 years. Now, if we were going to take a snapshot of transfer in general, just take that starting class, how many students at that moment were transfers? That might be a smaller number, maybe about 15%. But you have to think about how many of every brand new starting class are going to transfer at least once. And it becomes really, really abundantly clear that mobility is reality. Students are pursuing a variety of pathways to get to their bachelor's degree, and they're collecting credits from all sorts of locations and sources. So the fact that students are moving is real, and they are going to keep moving well into the future. So we talked about the pathways they take, and there are several terms that you may or may not be familiar with, but one of them is the vertical pathway, transferring from the community college to the four-year institution. There's the lateral pathway, and that's moving from a 2-year to a 2-year or a 4-year to a 4-year. There's also reverse transfer, where you're moving from a university to a community college and staying there for a semester or two or more. There's co and joint enrollment. That's when you are admitted to both a community college and a university at the exact same time, and you may take classes or have access to services and programs at one or both locations during the same semester. And then there's also this phenomenon called swirling, where you're moving back and forth amongst any number of these pathways, maybe starting at a 2-year, going to a 4-year, going back to a 2-year, or starting at a 4-year, going to a 2-year, and going back to the 4-year. And in fact, when we go back to those numbers, 38% of students transfer at least once within 6 years. But of that 38%, 45% of those students are transferring more than one time. So students are moving around a lot, just trying to make it to their degree in the most timely and cost-effective way possible. If you're wondering, we can look at the data and see that about half of all transfers are on that vertical pathway. But interestingly, 38% are lateral and about 12.5% are reverse. So it's not enough to just focus on vertical all the time. The literature is definitely vertical heavy, and that's where we're going to spend our time today. But these other pathways are very real mechanisms for getting to the 4-year degree. So we have to be very conscious of that. We are going to focus on the vertical pipeline today, and our reasons for that are pretty clear to us and pretty intentional. When we look at community college enrollment, we know that community colleges enroll almost half of all undergraduates, and they have even higher proportions of Black, Latinx, and Native American students than other institution types. They also tend to be first generation, low income, adult learner, and part-time students. So these are students who are already facing a number of systemic barriers in the education pipeline. And then when we add on to that the complexity of transitioning between institutions, the reason we wanted to focus on the vertical pipeline for this particular publication is because when we look at the numbers, there are clear race and income gaps in terms of who is able to get all the way through and finish that degree within 6 years. In fact, we know that white students are twice as likely as Black and Latinx students to reach that milestone. And high-income students are twice as likely as their low-income peers to reach that same milestone, graduating within 6 years of transferring. So these outcomes to us are simply unacceptable. So we wanted to take a look at what is going on and what can we do. There's got to be something. You're fortunate that there's a lot of research out there from the past couple of decades that tells us exactly what kinds of programs, policies, services really help and support transfer students on their journey. But there's a lot less information out there on the individual level practices that support that stuff. So that's why we're very consciously taking a look at the classroom. We know, as Peter mentioned, that faculty play a huge role in student success and transfer success specifically. So that's where we're going to go. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you so much, Emily, John, and Peter, for doing such a good job setting the context. Before I dive into practice one, let's pause for a moment and think about this. What descriptors or words, mine or others that I know, come to mind when we think of or talk about transfer students? If we take a step even further, what are the connotations or implied meanings of those words and descriptors? Are they framed as deficits or strengths? I think this awesome audience must be getting the rationale behind my questions. And yes, for those of you who are guessing, and you're right, our practice number one is exactly that: confront false assumptions and deficit thinking. Yes, and so I think I can say this with a lot of confidence. All of us here are really committed to supporting transfer students on an individual basis, or we wouldn't be here today. But at the same time, there are many, many assumptions about transfer students' academic preparation, their outcomes, and their community college education being so-called subpar, you name it. These assumptions are numerous, but they're simply not true. And these kinds of assumptions and biases can really impact negatively the ways in which we perceive and interact with transfer students, often without us or our colleagues even realizing, because they have very good intentions. So personally, as a faculty member who not only works with students who have transferred, but also study transfer students in my research since graduate school, I myself certainly have traveled a very evolving, long journey. It was actually through my own research with community college transfer students over the more recent past 5-6 years, and how I make sense of it in collaboration with students and my community college partners that have taught me to challenge some of my own and my colleagues' deficit thinking when we used words such as ensuring transfer students gain the confidence that they didn't have, or be more ready for 4-year, as if they were not enough to begin with. And also, certainly, thinking about how this guide came to be, the development of this work for all of us has been such an iterative and reflective process, really putting us in conversation and sometimes conflict with our own assumptions and biases, good or bad. And practice number one is actually the quintessential product of that iterative, reflective process. Because actually for this very first practice, we went from the angle of please do this and that to the current version of please first have an honest check-in with ourselves and our colleagues about our biases and false assumptions and deficit thinking. And please first help undo them. The undoing and unlearning from within, as opposed to just adding something from without, is very difficult, as we all can appreciate. But it'd be totally worth it, as without starting from within and working to undo false assumptions and deficit thinking, those things we do or want to do wouldn't realize their full potential. And now we can go to the next slide, because in the guide, we offer some more specific recommendations for practice one. As just a very brief high-level overview, we talked about how we can stop viewing transfer students as a problem to fix, but rather be ready for transfer students. We also discussed how to facilitate meaningful connections between transfer students' learning and their community, viewing their own learning and their community college education as assets. And our final recommendation is around adopting equity-minded approaches. So we offered a lot of details around these recommendations in the guide. But beyond the recommendations, we also leave you with a number of reflective questions that would help contextualize your efforts related to practice one. Among these questions are, we're going to go to the very next slide. And the first one is, what intentional efforts am I making to shift the mindset and practices related to transfer students away from deficit thinking? What am I doing? Can I do in my practices that truly celebrate transfer students as assets and success stories? Last but not least, what would I do differently moving forward? So you see, practice one brings up more questions than answers, but we view such reflexivity to be essential if we're really serious about supporting transfer students and acting on the rest of the practices in the guide. With that, I'm passing it next on to John.
Thank you, Julie. So our second practice is to know who our transfer students are. We know that every new college student, whether we're talking about students at two-year institutions or four-year institutions, has to make a series of adjustments to navigate their path towards success. And sometimes they have support around making those adjustments from family, from friends, from others they know who may have gone to college before. Sometimes they may not. And most frequently, they're looking for support around how they make those adjustments from folks at the college. And we know that faculty spend more time with students than pretty much anyone else at the college. And that's why these practices are so important and focused in this way for faculty. At many institutions, we know that transfer students are more likely to be from low-income families, from minoritized backgrounds, to be first generation, to be single parents, commuter students. And so those identities often bring with them additional barriers that our students have to navigate. So in addition to the typical adjustments to a new learning environment that any new college student is going to be facing, we know that transfer students might encounter additional hurdles. And some of these are life circumstances, and some of these are unintentional burdens or barriers that develop at the institution itself, bureaucratic, curricular. And so we know that we have to be really paying attention and really trying to work in a very conscious way to understand who our transfer students are and what has their journey been like and what will it be like. So we have a quote that we're going to share that I think helps to illustrate this really well in a very powerful way. A student says, "During the summer before my fall transfer, I researched and thought I had everything I needed to go into that space as best as I could. However, the culture and lack of transfer resources made it difficult for me to acclimate to the campus, and I had to develop my own figure it out yourself mentality. It seemed like all the guidance, support, and direction was only given to the freshman class. So me and other transfers had to make our own way. The culture also made it hard to figure out our place in the campus community. If you weren't set on what you wanted to do after graduation, you were stuck trying to figure it out yourself." I think it's so important that we always come back to the student voice and that we keep the student voice front and center. It helps, I think, to ground us and to help us remember why we are in this work and why we try to focus our energies the way we do. So we have a few recommendations for practice here. It's really important as we work to know our students that we look at institutional data about transfer. And if you don't have a strong relationship already with your colleagues in institutional research, we encourage you to get to know them and to build that relationship because they have really valuable data they can share about transfer students at your institution. And that's one really critical way you can get to know them. And if you can work with them, if they have not already disaggregated this data by race and ethnicity, by gender and income level, work with them and ask for that kind of disaggregated data because that's how we really come to understand who our students are. That's how we really get to know our students. The second practice we recommend is to learn with our colleagues. You very likely have some sort of professional learning, professional development center on your campus that is there to support faculty around teaching and around other areas of the faculty role at your institution. And that center may already have programs in place to support faculty and learning about transfer students, but if not, bring that request to the center, bring that request to your colleagues who are leaders of faculty, professional learning, educational development on your campus, because there are rich opportunities there to partner with your colleagues, whether you're a full-time faculty member or a part-time faculty member, or working in one or more offices around student affairs, work to build collaborations and work to learn together. The third practice that we recommend here, the third recommendation, is to really examine the transfer pathway and understand the barriers, the hurdles that students are experiencing. There are tremendous, extraordinary opportunities in the transfer pathway all the way through. But we also know there's a tremendous amount of research that tells us that students face all kinds of hurdles and barriers. And very often faculty are not aware of what those barriers look like or what it feels like to experience those barriers. One way that we can, I think, empathize even more deeply with our students is to ask them directly to share their stories. And so in the guide, we share under this second practice a recommendation to ask students to write an informal, ungraded autobiography during the first week or so of your term. It's a great way, a really low stakes way to make a connection with students, to begin to learn about them, for them to share the kinds of things they want you as an instructor, as a faculty member, to know about them. And it's a really helpful way as faculty for us to begin to move in the direction of really knowing our students, understanding the experience of transfer. I'm going to pass it now to Peter for our third practice.
Thanks, John. So welcome again, everybody. And notice that we've gone from ourselves and thinking about our own assumptions and biases and misconceptions to understanding who our students are in the aggregate, who our transfer students are as they come into our institutions and come into our courses as faculty. Practice number 3 is about what happens in the classroom and how we can offer what a colleague calls relentless welcome for students. The point being that students need to be welcomed not just on the first day they come to campus, not just the first day of the semester, of the quarter, but every day, to feel like they belong, to feel like they matter, to feel like they're connected. Now, many of our campuses and many of the folks on this call work to help transfer students feel oriented, to feel connected, to feel significant on campus. And that work is invaluable for our students. Yet the day-to-day experience students have in higher education is in our courses. Whether they're virtual, whether they're in person, whether they're hybrid or somewhere in between, the classroom is a site of welcome. It's a space where students need to feel or develop the sense that they belong. And the classroom is also the space where transfer students are most likely to feel this transfer shock, the sense that perhaps they're not in the same place, perhaps they don't fit, perhaps they're not sure how if they can navigate this before. And part of what we need to do is help them see that they have the assets, they have the capacity, they have the ability to do this, right? The research that we draw on the guide is very clear that all students benefit from frequent positive interactions with faculty and frequent positive interactions with peers in the classroom. And transfer students especially, and new majority students in general, specifically benefit from seeing faculty as approachable, helpful, and encouraging. So part of what we need to do in our faculty roles and what we need to help our colleagues do is create classrooms that are spaces where all students, particularly transfer students, feel welcome, feel capable, feel empowered to do their best work. So we have 3 recommendations for practice here. And the first one of these is to show an interest in students as individuals. And the example John gave near the end of his remarks about the autobiography, the ungraded informal autobiography, is a wonderful way to do that. Let me give you another example. which seems complicated, especially for those of us who teach large courses at large institutions, which is to use student names. But there's strong research, especially out of places like Arizona State University, that efforts by faculty to learn students' names, to use students' names, are powerful in conveying this belonging and welcoming, even when we don't actually know their names. If students just perceive we care to know their names, they're more likely to do their homework, they're more likely to feel welcome, they're more likely to ask for help. So make an effort to connect to students as individuals. The second recommendation is to affirm their capacity to learn and succeed. And so some of this, for transfer students in particular, but for all students, is to be transparent about what our expectations are of students, to be really clear, not just assume that they already know how to do this because this is a sophomore, junior, or senior level course, but to be clear about what the resources are, what the expectations are. And then the second part of this affirming capacity is pairing statements about high academic standards with statements about high academic belief, so that I know you're capable of doing this. This course is going to push you, it's going to challenge you, and I've seen students like you before rise to the occasion. I know you can too. So that pairing of high standards and high support, high belief is key. The last of our three practices here about welcome is doing all we can as faculty and others who work with students to normalize help-seeking behaviors. Transfer students, particularly first-generation transfer students, often are used to being successful by being entirely self-reliant. They do what Claude Steele calls over-efforting, and the answer to every problem is working even harder on your own. And we know from research that there are powerful academic resources that can help students succeed if we help them see that they might have misconceptions about things like the Writing Center or supplemental instruction. So if we can say to students, to all our students, but especially transfer students, successful students in this class use the Writing Center. So I want to encourage you to use the Writing Center. Successful students in this class work with TAs and do supplemental instruction. Successful students use office hours, and this is how we can do that. So really encouraging students to see help seeking as part of what it takes to be a successful student, not a sign of weakness, not a sign that students lack something. So that's practice 3. I'm going to turn it over to Lance to talk about practice 4 now.
Hello, everyone. Again, just want to build on what colleagues Peter, John, and Julie talked about. So practice 4 brings about some other unique or complex challenges that transfers face in terms of a physical space or locale. So to give you a bit of context as a focus on this particular slide, looking back at their journey prior to coming to the universities, that in addition to the affordable cost of a community college, transfers choose the community college as a path to begin their post-secondary journey because of its gradual, they see it as a gradual transition for them. The community college's geographic location, its size, and small class sizes mitigate barriers to connecting transfers with their professors and peers at the community colleges. So practice 4 builds on the relentless welcome described in practice 3 that Peter talked about, emphasizing that as a student-ready institution, it is a priority to know, understand, and respond to the needs of transfers. This entails acquiring a deeper understanding of the complexity of the challenges through their voices. And this is a point that John brought up. Transfers in particular, students of color, single parents, and commuter students, they may feel intimidation, doubt, and isolation. And these are things that emerge in my research in transfers. And these negatively affect their adjustment experiences to the university environment and not necessarily their academic capabilities. Next slide, Emily. So how can you replicate a similar classroom environment so that transfers better connect with the institution? What may this look like? We want to harness the power of peer relationships in the classroom by using active learning techniques and purposeful small group activities. Consider shifting to a learner-centered instruction, which ultimately increases their interactions with peers and faculty. Examples such as low stakes, service learning projects, whether facilitated on campus or through your learning management system, will help transfers find and use informal learning resources such as student organizations, mentoring programs, and transfer-focused network events, consequently minimizing the barriers they face to engagement and sense of belonging. Next slide, Emily. Another point is, to ensure transfers have equitable access to resources and the learning experiences afforded to direct entry students, take the time to learn about what resources are available at your institution and get to know more about your colleagues, such as your student affair professionals, to develop a deeper understanding of how to connect students with on-campus resources and invite them into your classroom. Because in doing so, for all students, these classroom visits, they can demystify and destigmatize campus resources while communicating to everyone, communicating that everyone is invested in and committed to their success. You may also schedule these classroom visits with academic support specialists, the director of undergraduate research, and so on, as transfer students often have fewer opportunities to participate in these opportunities as direct entry students. Also reinforce information sharing by including in your learning management system or course website. The idea is that implementing these strategies early in the semester helps transfers regain momentum while overcoming barriers to their adjustment experiences. I also want to end by acknowledging that, and Peter brought this point up earlier, that we are returning to classroom under pandemic circumstances. And this also creates other unique challenges to supporting transfers. So again, open to your other suggestions as we collectively find unique ways of supporting our transfers moving on. So I'll pass this on to Emily.
Thank you so much, Lance. I can only speak for myself here, but I just get blown away every time I listen to these professionals talking about their work. The passion just comes through so loud and clear, and I learn so much and have been so privileged to work with all of them. So we're going to shift our attention now to what is practice 5 in our guide, and that is work to improve systems and structures. Now, I want to acknowledge just right off the bat that this slide has 2 big words in there: systems and structures. And the guide, you've noticed sort of the flow. Again, we started very reflectively looking inward and thinking about ourselves. Then we went to practice 2 when we were talking to students and leveraging those interactions to learn more about them as individuals. We're honoring those experiences in practice 3 and offering a relentless welcome. And then in practice 4, we're really creating a classroom environment that helps transfer students know that they are welcome and that they can do it and that we're here there with them every step of the way to be successful. So now we're going back a step even further to look beyond the classroom at our broader campus cultures. So work to improve the systems and structures. Yes, you can, even as an individual, whether you're a faculty member or just a practitioner. We often can recognize, we see the system in place, but we think, oh, well, I'm just a cog. What do I do? How can I impact this? But here with practice 5, I think it's really important to remember this. Through no fault of their own, transfer students' experiences are powerfully shaped by systems and structures in and beyond higher education. And the phrase that I love there is through no fault of their own. Students are navigating this transition between our schools, doing the best they can. As Peter mentioned, some of them take on even more burden on themselves and work even harder to try to overcome some of the barriers we put in their way. But it's time, as Julie mentioned, for us to think about how do we not say, are they ready for us at the 4-year, but how can we be ready for them? And so we talk about 3 practices here in practice 5 to help look at that broader system and see where what you're experiencing in your one-on-ones with students and where what you're seeing in your classroom, how it fits in the broader campus environment. So we have 3 suggestions here, and you're going to notice that they're really similar to what John talked about in practice 2. But whereas his were very one-on-one with students, ours are now looking broader and more collectively. So it's similar themes. You need to look at your data. We talked before about having just the institutional profile and really leveraging that relationship with your institutional effectiveness office or institutional research office. But here you want to look beyond just the basic demographics of your incoming student class and look at your program data. Look at your class data. Look at your outcomes. Look at the credits earned and versus how many are actually applied to a degree. figure out, are students coming in and ending up with a bunch of excess credits that don't actually help them achieve their goal any sooner? One of the biggest barriers that students face is that excess credit accumulation, and that adds time and money to the overall cost of their degree. And so those are things that we can start to look at in that broader systems context. Also, again, here, learn with your colleagues. You've learned from your students in practice 2 about their journey, and assigning the autobiographical assignment, reading that, seeing what kinds of barriers pop up in their stories. But here you can take that information that you've learned, whether it's in your advising appointments or in those assignments, and share it with other people on your campus. I saw a comment earlier about talking about these things in our faculty meetings, and that's exactly what we mean. You can learn and share with your colleagues in informal situations. So whether you're just in the break room, grabbing your mail for the day, running into folks and sharing about the transfer students that you're interacting with, or in those more formal structures, whether it's a faculty meeting, a Senate meeting, a university meeting. But we've got to share what we learn, because transfer students touch every piece of our campus environments. So everybody holds a piece of the puzzle in understanding what their experience looks like. And we won't get a full picture until we talk to the students, but then also talk to our colleagues, which could be within our own academic departments, but also bring our student affairs folks in and our other academic affairs folks to the table so that we have a really big picture of what our students are experiencing. Can also do some professional development, perhaps partner with your teaching and learning centers to talk about transfer students and talk about some of the practices that we've talked about today, and really start to spread this information out, all in the name of making a more transfer inclusive climate. And then finally, you've got to examine the transfer pathway. One of the things I've noticed in my own research is that our institutional websites are very, actually, let me just be honest. I was going to say they're very pretty, and some of them are, and some of them are not. Students don't look for information the same way we organize information on our websites. And so we're putting things all over the place and not necessarily making a very clear connection for transfer students who are trying to navigate and understand, what classes do I need to take in order to be successful and line myself up to move right along my pathway. So you've got to look at the actual transfer pathway and how you're disseminating the information students need to get them along through their journey. So we've got some specific recommendations in the guide for that. But here again, these items are not things that we would expect an individual faculty member to do totally on their own. Certainly you can start the process, but this is where the collaborations really shine, because you can bring people into the conversation. I can almost guarantee you that there are other folks on your campus looking at transfer student success. And so with all of this newfound knowledge about transfer, you can go and say, what is already happening here? Where might I be able to get involved? How can I partner? Or how can I just offer what I've learned from my students in my autobiographies in those assignments? So the structures and the systems aren't going to change if we continue to abdicate responsibility to bigger systems like our state legislatures and like the government. We have to be prepared to look at the systems that are governing our own campuses and start to try to tweak as we can. So we're going to do that through learning with our colleagues and looking at data. So with that, you may be asking yourself, wow, this is a lot. What do I do now? And so I'm going to let Julie take us there.
Thank you. Yeah, so exactly. Thank you, Emily. And where do we go from here? We want to acknowledge first that even though, and especially because we've spent nearly 2 years brainstorming and writing the guide, we know it's hard and we know it's just a starting point. As a faculty member myself, I know the many constraints faculty have, and there are certain types of changes and factors that appear to be beyond our individual control. And especially as Emily talked about, transfer students do and continue to face numerous structural barriers. And those kinds of structural barriers especially appear to be beyond our individual control. But also, as Emily talked about in terms of practice 5, there were incremental steps that we could take that would eventually lead to structural level change. So don't underestimate our efforts in that regard. Equally important, just as very authentic individuals, as persons, I want to stress the importance to view our efforts to be never perfect, but ever learning, ever unlearning, ever evolving, and always reflective. And as you may have already realized, the kinds of reflection questions we posed in practice 1 and the guide as a whole are change and action-oriented questions. Emphasis on action and change, not on questions. And so I say the following to myself almost daily now, and also others when I give talks recently. I say this to me: reflexivity must result in action and change. reflexivity without action and change is not real reflexivity. You probably just think too much. And we don't want to just keep thinking. We are reflective doers and change agents for transfer students and should be held accountable first and foremost by ourselves as such. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much. I love ending on that note. So just a quick reminder to everyone that the guide will be available within the next few days. We're putting the finishing touches on the graphic design here. And so do watch your email for instructions on finding and downloading the guide. We hope it'll be useful to you, and we hope that you can share it with others on your campus. I also want to give a quick shout out to our friends at the Tackling Transfer Initiative. They are in the process of wrapping up some research that they've been conducting over a nice big year with partner institutions all across the country, Virginia, Minnesota, and Texas. And they're putting out, this is hot off the press, everyone. They're putting out another resource sort of related to ours. Next week, I believe, is their goal, and it's called Engaging Faculty Values to Develop Supportive Transfer Cultures, a toolkit for transfer champions. And so whereas our guide is very much that conversation starter, particularly for folks who are just beginning to wrap their mind around transfer and their role in facilitating transfer student success, this guide from our friends at Tackling Transfer, they are going to take it to the next level and give you even more specific suggestions on how you can leverage your faculty values to make a real difference in transfer student success. But again, we'll email you in a day or two a link to the recording to today's conversation, as well as a link to download the guide. But to conclude our conversation, we really want to open it up now to you. As we mentioned, we've got the chat open and we've got the question and answer box open. So we want to give you a few moments to type your thoughts or questions there. And in particular, we want to brainstorm a little bit with you on how you might enact these practices. What stuck out to you and what might you change in your practice heading into the fall semester, as well as how can we share the guide on our campuses. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to sort of brainstorm on that a little bit about how we might be planning to share the guide after it's published on our campuses, and then we want to hear from you too. So Lance and Peter, I don't know if you want to get that ball rolling, how you might take this back to your campus.
I can kick it off. As a transfer sending institution here at Durham Technical Community College, I imagine our Teaching and Learning Center really supporting the faculty across campus will take this guide and begin some small professional development opportunities to really think about some of the challenges that transfers can anticipate and bring that knowledge to the faculty so they themselves can take it back to the classroom and begin to really build on transfers agency as they begin to, to think about the institutions and the potential barriers that their peers may have experienced at the university. And also, it's an opportunity to also connect with students who have transferred to university and bring them back to talk to our community college students as they prepare to transfer to universities to talk more about how they can mitigate some of these barriers.
Well, and thanks, Lance. At a primarily transfer receiving institution, we're planning to use this guide in two different ways. One, just like Lance was talking about, our Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning already has some plans to draw on it for some workshops and also just to get it in front of faculty, because the guide was written in a way that it could be used in workshops and things like this, but it's also an independent document that can just be used. So individual faculty can read it and learn from it. The other thing we're planning to do is get the guide into department chairs' hands and encourage them to share it with their colleagues as appropriate, to talk with their colleagues about some of the ideas in this, because the practices are just generally good practices. And as Emily and others have said, working at the systems level is really important too. And departments are one of those systems where faculty can have some level of effect relatively directly. We've got some questions in Q&A, and I don't know if anyone else has something here they want to say, or we want to jump into the questions.
I know Julie's been waiting to answer one of the ones we have. So Julie, why don't you go for it?
I tapped Julie. Hi, the real Julie out there. I typed my answer to your question about the Inside Higher Ed article about resetting broken transfer system in the chat, but I hit the wrong button answering live, not my style. But in the chat, I mentioned I loved that article about their focus on equity, especially racial equity, and also their emphasis on fixing systems and structures, which completely aligns with the spirit of our guide. And also they were really honoring in all of their reform students, especially BIPOC students, sense of belonging and mattering, just in case the chat got lost.
I want to lift one thing up from the chat also that I think is really helpful, which Peggy Noon, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, said, and I think it's a key thing, which is thinking about librarians as assets and colleagues in this work too. Librarians often work closely with students on assignments and in other ways. And students often find librarians to be very friendly and helpful in a way that they're not quite as intimidated as they sometimes are by their faculty. So empowering our librarian colleagues both to understand transfer even more and to contribute really positively to transfer is really key. So I think this guide could be helpful, or maybe some of our ambitious librarian colleagues could adapt it for librarians directly also.
And Peter, it's actually so interesting you mentioned that, because NISTS is getting to do a few interviews with the Transfer Nation Talks podcast this year. And I'm not even kidding you, we just put one in for post-editing about using your librarians as transfer allies. And so if you aren't already familiar with the Transfer Nation Talks podcast, you can find that on Apple and Spotify, but that episode is going to be available a little bit later this month. We've got some authors from Florida who just wrote a book about that very thing. It's a very practical, wonderful advice. So the allies are all over campus, absolutely, if you look.
I wanted to address, I think one is Laura in the chat had mentioned just sharing this guide with community college faculty as well as university faculty. Yes, it's meant for all faculty. And what a great way to get the sectors to continue to communicate more, especially from the faculty. And that would even strengthen that bridge or connection that they themselves as faculty can build to support transfers as they go from a community college to a four-year university. So thank you, Laura, for putting that in the chat.
Yes, and also I just noticed Dr. Cooper put a complimentary support document from the RP group. Gosh, I love that organization, all the research they put out. So thanks, Dr. Cooper, for sharing that in the chat as well. And then Lance, I wonder if you can help me answer one of the questions we have in the QA box here. But someone asked, are there any particular majors degrees for transfer students that are especially difficult in your opinions? Any degree specific support to be aware of in your guides and toolkits? And so something that I see a lot, and certainly in your position, Lance, I think you probably see a lot. We hear that the STEM, and Julie, you just wrote a whole book about this, but the STEM pathway can be particularly difficult for transfer students to navigate because of the nature of the lockstep courses and getting off track and the complexity there. So would either of you like to comment on that a little bit, and then maybe how articulation agreements supposedly help? Maybe do, maybe don't.
Julie, did you want to, or you want me to go first? we're both STEM ratios, and I must shout out to Julie that really brought me on board and just been an inspiration to the research I'm currently doing on STEM transfers. But to Emily's point, yes. So the challenges and what's unique in that, transfers can pursue a STEM major at a universities from potentially 3 pathways from the community college: social and arts, science, or engineering, depending on the community college. But they themselves do experience unique challenges that are addressed in the guide. We didn't specifically speak to STEM, but they're also applicable to STEM transfers. But I did want to add, from my research, the STEM transfers, when you think about really the equity aspect of that, is essentially the demographic that's more likely affected by some of these barriers, and it's particularly those who are underrepresented, marginalized, and minoritized, primarily women of color. Again, we talk about the transfer population, those who are commuter students, so they experience similar barriers. But at disproportionate rates, in my perspective, of the research I've been doing. Julie.
Big shout out back, Red Chill, Lance, huge fan of your work. So I just wanted to quickly add, tangentially related, I really believe, I'm not a STEM faculty member, so I may not have the credibility, but my research has shown me the STEM faculty colleagues might really want to think about revisiting what it means to, for their offerings to be rigorous and to be so elite when one transferable STEM courses is offered only one singular time during a year, denying access and to so many students with the kinds of structural challenges Lance was talking about, and also certain ways of STEM subject matter being sequenced narrowly and constraining. So does it really always have to be that way? So I just pose that question that has really continued to perplex me, especially learning from the students in my research.
I see one more question that I'd like to bring up from the Q&A, if that's okay. So this comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Amy Waller Ivanecki. And she says, my colleagues and I have discussed the fact that it is important to understand which of our students were admitted as transfers. And initially, the students welcome that. However, at some point, we want to make sure they are integrating and no longer want to be treated or segregated as transfer students. Any thoughts on this? So I'll just start by saying, I think that's an important point, and I think that there's a balance that we need to walk there. What I will say is, when you get your hands on the guide this week, I think you'll find that the 5 practices are really, practices that are going to be supportive of student success in general. I wouldn't say any of these practices should be withheld from students who are not transfer students. I think they will be helpful to all students. And so I would try to think about, how might faculty take up these practices, weave them into the day-to-day practice with students, understanding, part of our argument here is know who your transfer students are, understand their unique journey, but understand the unique journeys that all of our students have. And I think our transfer students are, one important dimension of that bigger challenge that we face as educators.
And just to build on John's point really quickly, I think another way to respond to Amy's question, in addition to what John is saying, is that if and as we use active learning, especially peer-based active learning work in our classes, we're weaving all of our students, but especially our transfer students, into the peer community, in the discipline, in the course, in the campus, right? And so students are not going to feel like transfer students after a little while if they've gotten to know some of their peers. And we can do that in our classes really intentionally. But my campus only has 6,000 undergraduates, so it's not as big as some. But we know from our research on our campus, the first thing students do in the first day of class is they look around the room. Who do I know? And they go sit by those. And so if you don't know somebody, that's not very comfortable. So how do we, on the first day of class, the first week of class, help connect students with peers and not say, if you're a transfer student, raise your hand, look at this. Just have them connect with people they don't know already in the classroom. Help them do purposeful work in the class right away. And then they're going to make that transition often on their own successfully.
Absolutely. And with that, I think it's safe to say we're rounding down here to 3 p.m. our time, Eastern time. So we're right at the close. But we want to thank everyone for your time today. Thanks so much for joining us in this conversation. And we hope that the guide will be useful to you. As I mentioned, please keep an eye out for an email and I'll send you instructions on how to get it. And we hope you can share it widely. And if you have questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. But transfer students are as unique as all the pathways they take. And it is something to be celebrated for sure. So we welcome you to this conversation. If you aren't already, feel free to engage with NISTS. Join us for National Transfer Student Week in October. Join us at the Transfer Nation Digital Hub. Heather Adams started that group, but there's so much great conversation and traction on transfer. So we so appreciate your time. And thank you to our wonderful panelists, these experts, privileged to work with you on this. So thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.